We had a little technical problem, but we're working to do that and be with you very shortly. My name is Peter Larson. I am the chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, a small Ottawa-based NGO, and we will be starting very shortly. So please bear with us for a moment or two. I will introduce Dr. Loubani, and I will introduce our panelists who will be helping me interview Dr. Loubani. So it's now 7:31. Give us another 3 or 4 minutes, please, before we start this YouTube-based, live streamed and live Zoom-based webinar with Dr. Tarek Loubani. So once again, my name is Peter Larson, and I'm the chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. We're waiting for Dr. Loubani to connect remotely. In the meantime, I have a little slideshow introduction that I'd like to show all of you about the situation in Gaza. And before I even do that, I'll point out that I'm wearing an orange t-shirt with Indigenous motif on it in a gesture of solidarity with Canada's Indigenous people that we have been hearing the tragic news about in the last few days. And we unfortunately expect that that's going to be in the news for the next several days. So I put this on. I'm going to share this presentation with you. Can someone raise their thumb to show that you do see, in fact, the presentation? Do we see it there?
Yeah, I see your screen.
Okay, great. Oh, I'm using my own presentation because you were working to get. Have you got Dr. Loubani yet?
Yeah, he's joining soon. Do you want me to share the deck?
Yeah, so why don't you do your deck then? I'll stop mine and you do yours, and that'll make things easier.
Perfect.
Okay. Apologies for our awkward beginning, but it will end with great splendor, I'm sure. Hey man, if you want to share the deck now, I can do that while we're waiting for Dr. Loubani. So the session today, welcome everybody. The session today is on Gaza's health system, underfunded, under COVID, and under occupation, with Canadian Dr. Tarek Loubani, who often goes to Gaza and works at Al-Shifa Hospital. Next slide, please, Iman. This presentation is put on by the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, which is a very small Ottawa-based NGO focusing on education around the Israel-Palestine issue. We have a website, www.ottawaforumip.org. If you go to that website, you can see our objectives, our mission, you can see about us, including our leadership, as well as our very distinguished advisory panel. And also in the library, you'll see all our previous websites. So I encourage you to go there. Next slide. So our agenda tonight is quite simple. There's this welcome. We started 2 or 3 minutes late. I'm going to do a little bit of a background on Gaza, and then we will have this interview with Dr. Tarek Loubani for about 40 minutes or so. And in that, I'll be assisted by 2 other panel members who I'll introduce in a second. And then we'll turn to questions and answers from the audience. and we will adjourn. I ask the audience people to ask questions that they want using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can use the chat function if you want to share ideas with each other or with the panelists, that's fine, but we will only be taking the questions that appear in the Q&A function. So please, if you have an important question you want to ask Dr. Loubani, please put it there. I note, please, that we're really only interested in questions on Gaza's health system. So please don't ask Dr. Loubani what he thinks about Israel's new government, or what he thinks about what Mr. Biden is going to do, or what he thinks about BDS. Please, let's stick to questions to really draw on Dr. Loubani's expertise as a Canadian doctor working in the Gaza health system. Next slide. So just a very quick review of the geography. For many people on this webinar, this will be old hat, but for a few it may not be. And therefore, I think it's important to review it. Here we have an Israeli map. You see it's written in English and in Hebrew. In the bottom left corner, the beige is Egypt. Then on the right, you have Jordan, Syria at the top right, and Lebanon at the top. And of course, it's all against the Mediterranean Sea. So that area in between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan is variously called Israel or Palestine, or Israel-Palestine, or Israel and the West Bank. But that's the general area we're talking about. The country called Israel, that Canada recognizes Israel, is in the light beige marking. It goes from the top of your screen to the very bottom. And in that area, there are about 7 million Jews. The total population is about 8.5 million, approximately, and approximately 1.6 million Palestinians live in Israel as citizens of Israel. Some of them live in Jerusalem, which is the large city in the middle of the belly of that kidney-shaped area. In the West Bank, which is the greenish-looking area on the right-hand side, that is called that because it is the west bank of the Jordan River, live about 3 million people, of whom about 600,000 are Jewish settlers. And then the area as of interest to us today is Gaza, which is in the bottom left corner. You can see it's marked Gaza, and that has a population of about 2 million people. Next slide. I say one slide, I say 2 million, this side I say 1.9. I don't know which of them is right. But there's a very young population, about 40% of them are under 25. And most of the people who live in Gaza are not from Gaza. Most of them are from Israel, either themselves or descendants of people who were expelled from Israel in 1947-48. They're almost all Muslim. There is a small Christian community in Gaza. What may surprise some people is that Gaza has a very high literacy rate, crowding 100%, and has 6 universities. And by universities, I mean real universities. On the other hand, it's very poor. Its GDP per person is about $600 per month, which is just about 12% of the Canadians. The whole Gaza area is 365 square kilometers, compared, for example, to 2,700 for Ottawa. So Ottawa has half the population on about 8 times as much the area. And Gaza has been blockaded by Israel since 2007. Next slide, please. Now, what do we mean by the slide of the blockade? Well, Israel has actually erected a fence on all sides. It calls it a border, but it's a fence on all sides. It's 15 or 20 feet high, but sometimes it's a chain link fence with machine guns on the top. It's blockaded by land, sea, and air. And furthermore, on the inside of the fence, there is a no-go area 300 meters. So anybody who goes within 300 meters is at risk of being shot by the Israelis to keep people away. And Palestinians need permission to enter or to exit Gaza. And there are 2 main routes that people can use. In the bottom left corner, you see Rafah, where it says Philadelphia route. That is an exit into Egypt. But Egypt coordinates very closely with Israel. And at the very other end of Gaza, at the top, you see it's barely, you can see it says Erez crossing point. That is where most Palestinians would come in or go out if they're going, for example, to the West Bank or going to Jordan. But there's a very small trickle of people who do so. Next slide. To help me discuss with Tarek tonight, our two panelists, I'm thrilled to have them. Robert Cushman is a primary care physician, or formerly a primary care physician, formerly emergency room physician at the Children's Hospital in Ottawa, so does or has done some of the same kind of work that Tarek has done. He's also formerly the medical officer of health for the city of Ottawa, so he knows a lot about health systems. He's also worked in very challenging environments, including northern Quebec, serving Cree and Inuit populations, and 3 years working in a mission hospital in Zambia. And now, of course, given his experience, he is frequently consulted in program evaluation at home and abroad. So welcome, Robert. Jessica Bernstein is a Canadian lawyer. She worked and lived for 5 years in Israel, Palestine, and several of those years, she was working as the international relations coordinator for Gisha, an Israeli NGO which assists Palestinians in Gaza in their freedom of movement. So Jessica knows a lot about the issues facing Palestinians in Gaza. She formerly practiced law with the Ontario government, and she's currently working in the field of legal education in Toronto. And I'm very proud to say she's a member of OFIP's Council of Advisors. Next slide. Now we come to the pièce de résistance, our guest speaker, Tarek Loubani. Dr. Loubani is an emergency room doctor. He was born in Kuwait of Palestinian refugee parents, trained in family medicine at McGill and did an emergency medicine residency at Queen's. He is today associate professor of medicine at Western University in London, Ontario. He frequently goes to Gaza, but I actually don't know what the frequency is, so we'll ask him about that. But when he's there, he works as an emergency room doctor at Al-Shifa Hospital. And he is the founder of the GLIA project, which found a way to make low-cost stethoscopes in Gaza using 3D printing technology. When he was in Ottawa, next slide. When he was in Ottawa last year, he told us about I think that was 2020, as a matter of fact. He spoke at the Unitarian congregation here and talked a bit about the GLIA project, and he got a full crowd. And part of it was, of course, that Dr. Loubani had been quite famous in Canada because he had been shot during the Great March of Return. And even Mr. Trudeau, for a short instant of time, showed some interest in this issue. Next slide. Unfortunately, I've learned through the internet, and maybe Dr. Loubani will be able to tell us something about this, but that GLIA project, where they're manufacturing these stethoscopes, as I understand, was one of the buildings that was bombed by the Israelis in its most recent attack on Gaza. So I can end the share screen here, and I can come back to see the faces of my two panelists and Dr. Loubani. Would you end the share screen, please, Iman? End the share screen, please. Hey man, can you please stop share screen? Hey man, can you hear me? There we go. Okay, that's great. Finally, thank you. So wonderful. Let me, you can unmute yourselves. Dr. Loubani is obviously in some cold place because he has a fire behind him. He's not in Canada. He must be not even in the Arctic. I think
I'm in London, Ontario.
You're in London, Ontario. Okay.
Still cold for a Palestinian.
Yeah. Well, welcome, Dr. Loubani, and welcome to our two panelists. Actually, I see Robert Cushman has got some intellectual reinforcement sitting with him, so that's great. Welcome to Lynn McGregor, his partner, and also a nurse who's had a lot of experience with medical systems. So Lynn, please feel free to chip in. And Jessica Bernstein, welcome to you as well. Tarek, I want to start off the first kind of question just to set the stage here. Can you just give us a bit of a story about how a man born in Kuwait comes to be doing medicine in London, Ontario? Like, how to just give us a bit of background so we understand where you're coming from.
Okay, so basically, I'm Palestinian, of Palestinian origin. When I was born in Kuwait, I was born as a refugee. My parents, my father is from a tiny community in what was northern Palestine called Sasa. And that when that village was cleared out of all of its Palestinian inhabitants, his family went to a refugee camp called Nahr al-Barid in Lebanon. My mother was from another tiny village called Brej, which was halfway between Jerusalem and Ramla. And when that village was destroyed, they ended up in a refugee camp that eventually became part of the West Bank. And so when they met in medical school in Egypt, my father was not allowed to go to my mother's area when they decided to get married. My mother, of course, was not allowed to go to my father's area.
Tarek, can I interrupt for a second?
Of course.
I have several people saying your audio is very faint.
Okay, let's see if we can turn it up.
You,
is that better?
That's much better. I think I could hear that.
All
maybe
right.
even that's overcorrection a little bit.
Okay, how's this? Is that better?
Perfect. Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks.
I got a little
those who
knob here. I
commented on
can
that.
turn it, so
Okay.
you just tell me and I'll turn it up or down as needed. So to the 5-second rehash, born to Palestinian parents in a country that accepted them because the Israelis wouldn't allow them to be in the West Bank together, and the Lebanese wouldn't allow them to be in a refugee camp in Lebanon together. So that's why I was born in Kuwait. There's no connection to Kuwait otherwise. I'm not Kuwaiti. There's no citizenship by birth there, so I'm not Kuwaiti or anything of this variety. And then when the Gulf War happened in 1990, my family were lucky enough to have an uncle here, my father's brother, and so we came. We came to Canada and ended up sort of naturalizing and growing up here. And of course, I became aware of something that was not available to other Palestinians and other people all over the world, which is all the opportunities in Canada. To me, that was the single biggest driver. I owe something to the people I left behind. And that probably is one of the most animating characteristics of the decisions that I make. I truly live a privileged and blessed life. And I don't hate it. I love that life, but I hate the fact that I can live this way. And the people who I grew up with, who I went to elementary school with, the people who I left behind can't. So that's why I'm still in Canada. And that's also why I spend so much time in the Gaza Strip. I mean, my dirty little secret is I don't really care about the Palestinians or the Palestinian cause per se. I really care about them insofar as this is a human rights issue, and I care about human rights of everybody. So I work on all kinds of issues, from the environment and making sure that that's safe for future generations, to indigenous issues, to lots of work in Latin America, where I used to spend a significant amount of time before the projects in Gaza really kicked up and took up most of my attention. So that's the why of it, maybe.
Okay. Then the other question that sort of flows from that: why Gaza? I mean, what, you don't really have a link to, not like your parents were from Gaza. Did that happen? How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, and again, it doesn't matter that I don't have a link, because that's not why I do it, right? I don't feel a connection to Palestinianhood. Those who understand my politics know that I don't care about nations. I don't think that they are an overall positive force. And nationalism certainly doesn't animate or move me in any way. I think it's generally counterproductive. So really, for me, the main thing is, well, how can I impact on the human rights of people? And Gaza is very special because it's kind of a project that is on the verge of both success and failure. And in so being, we can put a relatively small amount of effort into Gaza and get big results. Or if it fails, I think it sets back the movements for human rights within indigenous communities all over the world, occupied communities all over the world, by years or decades. So I think the victories are big, and I think the losses would be substantial. And that's what I always saw in Gaza. If you really think about it, there's absolutely nothing special about me. And lots of my projects involve lots of people, but really I'm one person. So it's very rare, even in Canada, in London, Ontario, I don't think as one person I'd be able to make that much impact. But because Gaza's system is teetering, little pushes in one direction or the other can really make a huge difference. And that's why Gaza.
Thank you. Okay, that's a great introduction. And I'm now turning to my expert panelists to help me quiz you. And I'll start off with Rob. Do you want to just take a first crack at it?
Well, welcome, Dr. Loubani. It's a privilege to have you here, and we want to clearly hear about your experience. I think we'll stick to Gaza tonight, although I'm sure Latin America would be equally interesting. So my question for you, just as an opener, is most of us have either worked or have been a patient in a clinic in Canada, or even an emergency room or in a hospital. So sort of jumping from that, when you go to Gaza, what really strikes you? When you leave the London Health Science Center and 5 days later you find yourself working in Gaza, just in terms of the work, the patient care, the environment, what are the biggest striking differences that immediately come to mind to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it is something that really messes with me and messes with everybody I know who does work in places like Gaza. You really have to leave aside practice in Canada, and when you come back, you really have to leave aside what you saw in a place like Gaza. I mean, this morning, for example, I had a shift, and during that shift, I had a patient who needed an MRI. I ordered it, happened within an hour. I mean, that is the kind of luxury and privilege that we live in Canada. And when I go to Gaza, I try not to think that much about it. You know, I try not to think about how easy it would be to do this in Canada. For me, there are two problems in Gaza. One of them is the sheer lack of resources. For example, you know, I kind of contextualize them myself into falling into three big categories. There's a clear infrastructural lack. The hospitals themselves are run down. There's no electricity, there's no water. Those are kind of three big parts of infrastructure. The other one is the training. You know, the training, they try very, very hard, and people do as well as they can given the circumstances. But there are doctors there, not only who have never trained outside, but who were born and raised inside. We're now getting to the point where there are some doctors coming in who have literally never left Gaza at all for any reason, because of the blockade that started in 2006, 2007. And then the third thing, of course, is the devices. You know, let's say if they had a working institution, and let's say that they had the training, when I would teach my students how to use, for example, there's a chemical we use on very sick patients to make them unconscious called propofol. Really nice, really slick medication. It's the standard of care. I teach it to my residents, but it's like teaching somebody how to walk on the moon. They will never experience it because there they use a drug that you might recognize, Dr. Cushman, which is pentothal. So essentially it's a barbiturate that, you know, it was probably used when you started practice, is definitely not something that any of my colleagues here who have, you know, who don't have gray hairs would even know the name of. So it's a multifaceted problem, and seeing it and recognizing it is one thing. The thing that I think induces the most frustration, though, isn't just the lack of resources. Because, you know, for example, if I were to take a group camping on a mountain, we'd have a lack of resources, but we wouldn't feel so crushed. I think what really bothers so many people is that it doesn't have to be that way. As Peter mentioned, the population is very well educated. There's still a substantial number of doctors who've trained outside and who are very, very well versed in modern medicine. They keep up very well with what's going on. And it simply doesn't have to be as bad as it is. And it's not a question of Israel providing aid or the international community providing aid. It's a question of letting the noose, you know, off of the neck of sort of the Palestinian medical system and letting it breathe so that it can do for itself what it needs to do to take care of its patients.
Thank you. Jessica, do you want to follow?
Sure. Yeah, we can go back and forth. Hi, Dr. Loubani. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Hi. And please call me Tarek. That's
okay.
we can drop those formalities. Unless I'm going to call you guys by titles. Yeah, great.
Well, I don't have one, so that would be hard. You touched on a lot of threads just now, I think, that we'd like to pick up on, but I'll just start with one. Can you kind of tell us or paint a picture at a broad level, or even at day-to-day operations, when you're working in Gaza? What is it like? How do you and your medical colleagues there cope with the challenges that you just described?
Yeah, I mean, okay, I'm going to get into it, but first I just feel like I have to say, Jessica, that I love you. Thank you so much for all of your work. Gisha is one of the most important organizations in terms of access and trying to break the blockade. The lawyer who has helped me get
she's blushing, Tarek.
I am.
The lawyer who helped me get into Gaza and is absolutely amazing, Leora Behor, also I think did some time with Gisha. And so I became very, very familiar with Gisha as a person who cares about access and about rights. So thank you so much for that work. I think it's very, very easy to look at a doctor and say like, wow, you go, you run the front lines, you get shot, you know, this is important. And it is, but we very often forget the people who are working in the back lines. Like for me to go there, you had to do your work. Could not have happened without you. I would not be able to move without people like you. So thank you. In terms of sort of answering your question, and I think I might have lost it, sort of how do we cope with the situation? I mean, that's a big one. I think the reality is that we very often put forward these narratives of resilience and about how well we deal with these situations. But it's a terrible fucking situation. And a lot of people don't and can't cope. A lot of people break down and can never come back. And so on the individual level, really it's about trying to be as kind as possible to each other and as supportive as possible to each other, while also recognizing that we fall sometimes, we become casualties sometimes. I started working in 2011 in the Gaza Strip, and I don't think there's more than a couple of doctors in the emergency who are the same doctors who I started out with. You know, there are heavy losses to PTSD, to all kinds of other things. You know, for example, during one of the wars, there was this really remarkable, brilliant pediatrician who was there with us, and we were dealing with wave after wave after wave of people coming in with crush injuries, because I think this was 2012. There was no ground invasion then. It was just buildings coming down on people, very similar to this time. Crush injuries are awful because you largely see the person and they're just dead in front of you, and they look very much like they could be alive, but for sort of something that happened. Of course, there are people who are, like for lack of a better word, smushed, and that's awful. You see little pieces of them like a bug that got squashed on the ground. But having said that, you know, it's just a terrible, and it's constant, and it's all the time, you know, sort of 24 hours a day. And I remember sort of just we're doing our thing, and he snapped, and he started yelling and screaming and just sort of saying like, what is this life and what are these wars? He had been through 2006 and he had been through 2008, 9, and then here he was in 2012, and these are the major confrontations. There were so many in between there, and he never was able to really practice medicine after that, you know, seeing all of these things happen. In that moment, of course, like what we did was we told him to shut up. You know, it was not the time, it was not the place. And we had no tolerance for that kind of stuff. We did what we had to do to maintain our professional environment. But of course, you know, what makes us good doctors makes us kind of terrible human beings, right? Because what he needed was a hug, was some love, was somebody to care for him. And of course, that wasn't going to be forthcoming. So how do people cope? I mean, it's, yes, we have lots of casualties, the psychiatric casualties, the other kinds, the suicide rate is 6 times what it is in Canada. And of course,
among doctors, do you mean among doctors, or you mean the population?
No, just population in general. And so we know that people are really suffering. But I think the flip side is, it's really remarkable how people who are hobbling are still able to see tomorrow and work for tomorrow and really look towards trying to do something. I don't think anyone comes out of the occupation unscathed, but I think because people believe that they're doing something that matters, that's really what keeps us going. It's the similar thing that animates everybody everywhere in medicine, which is the feeling that you're needed to help and make things work out.
Well, thank you. That's very compelling. That's for sure. I really, my hat goes off to you and your colleagues. I just to change a little bit here. You have worked in Latin America, and we look at sort of developing countries, and now you've basically described a war zone. If you could just give us a little perspective from the patient and the population's point of view, you have touched obviously on the trauma and the crush injuries and the war zone, but also you did a lot of that actually with staff, but some of that, the resilience you were talking about, the suicides on the other hand, with the population, but also what, on a good day, when you're not seeing, major trauma from a war zone, what do you see? Do you see sort of Western chronic diseases? Do you see a mix of what we see in developing countries? We've heard, for instance, that sanitation levels are not quite what they should be. So if you can just describe that a little bit for us, it'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some funny statistics that people don't realize, like more people die from car accidents in the Gaza Strip than from war.
Okay.
And so our trauma teams activate the majority of the time on car accidents. So when you think about a car accident and all the things that go into a car accident, you have people who aren't wearing seatbelts. There's almost no seatbelt usage there because there's almost no civilian police force there because there's almost no salaries paid there. The roads would need to be paved properly, which you can't do because you don't have the equipment for it and you don't have the raw materials like asphalt and concrete for it. And of course, at night, there's no lighting. There are no street lights. If there are street lights, you can't depend on them because there's no electricity. And so it's a pervasive all systems problem. And you're right, it's easy and to some extent it's sexy to talk about the war traumas, but we lose more people to the day-to-day casualties. And that extends. So for example, I had this one incident, this one was in Iraq when I was there, but the same type of incident, happens all the time and the same mentality happens. But I had this one guy who had, I think, 13 gunshot wounds from an attack on his car. And I'm doing the screening. I was in medical school at the time when I was in Iraq, so it was quite a while ago. And I'm doing the screening, and one of the questions I hit is, "Oh, well, do you smoke?" And he's like, "Well, yeah, I smoke a pack a day." I'm like, "Oh, well, you should quit. That stuff will kill you." Of course, like only a medical student could ever sort of muster the naivete for. And he just looked at me like I was from some other planet. And of course, the mentality is that who cares if I smoke? I could get killed tomorrow anyway. And so lung cancer rates are up. And of course, early detection is not a thing because it doesn't matter. You're never going to get out. You're not going to get chemotherapy. Why would you do early detection when there's no treatment? So it becomes a very pervasive thing. 50%, this number is rough, but around 50% of Palestinians over the age of 50 have diabetes. Well, that makes perfect sense when you consider that it's very hard to get proper nutrition there. Meat is very difficult to come by, proper fresh fruit. Ironically, because of the occupation, because of the blockade, they're able to maintain their own food rather than being forced to export it like so many other countries and developing regions. But still, there's just not enough fresh food. And so there's a lot of processed food. There's not enough clean water. 95% of the water is not usable. That doesn't mean that people aren't drinking water. It just means they're drinking bad water. And so waterborne illness is a huge thing. Like, did you know there's a hepatitis E? I didn't until I showed up there. So these are the sorts of things that really kind of are pervasive. And day to day, most of my time there, outside of war situations, is not spent with war traumas. It is spent talking to people day to day, trying to convince them about public health measures, trying to resist the forces that are sort of set in place by the blockade.
Thank you. Jessica.
Thanks, Robert. Tarek, I wonder if you could tell us a little more about, at a maybe slightly more granular level, about some of the resources that are actually missing. You know, when you're practicing there day to day, medicines. You mentioned devices. You of course mentioned training, which is I understand a big issue. But yeah, day to day, sort of what are the kind of stumbling blocks that you're regularly encountering when you're working as a medical practitioner in Gaza?
Yeah, so there's essentially, there are kind of two big problems. One is actually being able to get stuff, and the other one is being able to pay for it. The Palestinian cause, writ large, doesn't really have a money problem. There's a lot of money that people are able to spend on things for Palestinians. However, the money can't move. You know, I think I could probably sooner get rockets into Gaza than get some money to pay doctors into Gaza. And that's not really an accident, because rockets are much less damaging than withholding salaries from doctors. The best doctors I know here would really struggle to work there, to work anywhere if they weren't paid for years on end. And functionally, doctors haven't been paid since 2013. There are intermittent and partial payments and so on, but really since the coup in Egypt, there haven't been salaries in Gaza for much of the public sector. So the salaries become a problem. And again, these are all, we're now building sort of foundationally, you know, what people suffer from day to day. My residents, I had this one resident, and I was so frustrated with this guy because he just would always be late, sometimes wouldn't show up. And finally, I just confronted him, like, listen, what is going on? Why aren't you showing up for your shifts on time? Why aren't you checked in when you are here? You know, what's happening? And he confided in me that he had no source of income, and so he had to sell fruit. And of course, because the money was so scarce, he also would generally walk or take very unreliable forms of public transportation to get to the hospital from a region that was relatively far from the hospital where we were at. So, I mean, you can't really begrudge the guy not sort of being fully engaged when it's hour 16 for him and hour number 1 for me. And so it's really hard to do anything when the payment structures are so broken. And of course, they draw out the doctors into private practice where they can make a little bit of money, or into non-medical work where they can make a little bit of money, like selling fruit. The day-to-day supplies is another big deal. Like, for example, let's say I want to figure out if a person has an appendicitis, right? In Gaza, that's actually pretty easy. It's actually easier than it is here in London, Ontario, because the two things I need are a bit of blood work called a CBC, a complete blood count, and an ultrasound. And we got those two things in spades. No problem. They're low resource tests. But let's say that I have a different kind of patient and I want to know if there's something wrong with their kidneys. This can be something that is a very urgent problem. Or are they having a heart attack? Very, very urgent problems. And yet the tests for those are either completely unavailable or will take 6 hours to come in. Like, how can you practice medicine on a test that takes 6 hours to return? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. And so I've had to learn to trust my clinical skills, which anybody who's practiced in Canada will know we are very weak on clinical skills. We are very good on investigations and electronic diagnostics, CT, MRI, stuff like that. So those sorts of little investigations are missing. And those things are missing largely because the reagents are missing. The machines are there, the training is there, but you need a day-to-day supply of reagents. They expire, they go bad, they run out, and so you need all of those things. And then, of course, the medication situation is absolutely abysmal, absolutely abysmal. You know, if you break your arm, you're lucky. That doesn't really need medication, so a doctor can fix it. But if you break your arm, you're not going to get any pain medication while they fix it. You know? There are narcotics. Narcotics are some of the upper end of pain medications, but they're so rare that they're held for the sickest patients. They're not available in the emergency, for example. You'd have to go to the operating room to get them. So in terms of medication, anything that is comfort related, we don't prioritize. For example, when I was shot, I was offered ibuprofen, also known as Advil or Motrin. And that was it. You know, like I try to think of doing that in London. I mean, that would be frank malpractice. But that's what we have there. So you kind of have to deal. Yeah. So I think that those are kind of the pieces of it. I think I've covered maybe some of the granular stuff without getting too into the weeds. I'm a wonk for this stuff, so I don't mind going into the weeds, but maybe
we have
I'll stop there.
About 10 more minutes of this interesting panel discussion, and I'm going to open it up to the audience to send in questions. Please put them in the Q&A, not in the chat. We will be looking at the Q&A function. Jessica or Rob?
So, Tarek, thank you for this again. So I just wonder, in terms of the public-private sector, is there a differential, the shortages you've been talking about in the hospital? And I think you alluded to earlier that, in fact, a physician could do better in private practice. So in terms of primary care, or just other, the availability of medical personnel and diagnostics and basic important medications, is there any difference if you move out into the community and possibly into a private sector? Do you see a differential, or is it the same overall?
Oh, it's a big question, because the private sector is a parasite. So private sector medical service was something that I academically understood was bad before I went to Gaza. But when I got to Gaza, I really came to terms with how unhealthy and dangerous it is. So functionally, what the private sector does is it takes some of your best doctors out, because not every doctor is driven by the ideologies or by idealistic sort of notions of providing medical care. And even those who are, well, I mean, they have families, they need to feed their families, they need to put a roof over their heads. Like, lots of them have really suffered and struggled, and very few doctors are really willing to forego all salary for now going on sort of 10 years. So what the private sector functionally does is it takes the healthiest patients out of the system and then profits from them, so it takes money from them. And then when they, and by the way, they're treated then by the best doctors. And then when they have complications, which is perfectly normal even for the best doctors, they're returned into the public system, which then becomes overburdened. The private sector is profit driven, always, everywhere. There is no such thing as a private sector that's like, no, let's forego our profits because we care so much about people. And so they tend to cut corners. They cut corners on staff available, which is reducing safety, on medications administered, on quality of equipment. And so they drive higher rates of complications, which then they return into the public sector, which is now missing some of its best doctors and resources, and then gets a reputation among the public for not being something that someplace where you want to be. And of course, the doctors who do, so Gaza mandated the doctors do public service for them to hold a license. And then what that ended up doing was it ended up with OR slowdowns, because now you have doctors who don't want to be there. And so they're like, well, you know, if the system works great here and they're getting my service for free, then why would they come to my clinic? So they would slow down the public ORs by making unreasonable demands, taking longer in the OR, you know, whatever you want to say. So these are very practical, like actual problems that are faced when you have a mixed public-private system. No, you don't get better care in the private system, but that's true really everywhere. And I don't think people always believe it. Like even in Canada, people say, oh, well, let's go to some, you know, private clinic in the States will get better care than here. Or I hear often in the emergency, oh, if we were to privatize care, everything would be better. That's nonsense. And Gaza is a living example of how it's nonsense. Okay, I'll stop there. I feel like I might have ranted there a little bit.
Do patients pay for their health service when they go to the Al-Shifa hospital, which is a public hospital? Do they pay for that? Is there insurance? How does that work?
Yeah, the technical answer is yes, they pay, but that is only the technical answer. So there are so many, you can buy public insurance for 10 shekels a year, which is $3 American, $5 Canadian per year. You know, does that mean you're paying for insurance? Yes. Is that essentially completely symbolic, even for the poorest Gazans? Yeah, that's a symbolic amount. And if you've been shot or wounded by the Israelis at any point, then you do not have to pay even those $5 a year. And if you're a family member, then you don't have to pay. So like 99, yes, technically there is a scenario in which you could go to the hospital and have to pay the full ride, but I can't imagine who's not exempt at this point. Like hell, if I were to go to the hospital, I'd be exempt now from paying any fees. So it's, yes, technically you do have to pay, but functionally and practically no.
Peter, do we have time to make?
Yeah, sure. One more each, and then we'll turn it out to the audience. So go ahead, Jessica.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, I'm curious about how big a role external or foreign doctors like yourself play in administering healthcare in Gaza, given the dearth in resources you spoke about and lack of training.
Okay, so sorry, I missed that. You cut out a little bit. So you're saying what is the role of international doctors in?
Yeah, how big a role do they play in delivering healthcare in Gaza?
Yeah, that's another really big question and a problem that I think we're all struggling with. So for me personally, I don't fall under NGO command. Basically, there are 3 kinds of medical care that are delivered in a place like Gaza: strictly public, which is controlled by the Ministry of Health; strictly private, which is generally driven by Gazans themselves for profit. I mean, profit is a, I think nobody there really profits like blindly. Nobody, society wouldn't tolerate it. And then the intermediate sector is the NGO sector, which does run a series of clinics and hospitals. Somebody was asking about MSF. You know, MSF operates a clinic there. Medical Aid for Palestinians. All of these NGOs sort of operate there. And what was happening for quite a while is that the NGOs and the doctors working with them would then be insulated from the direction of the public, because fundamentally, regardless of sort of how authoritarian the current government in Gaza is, there is some popular pressure that that people can apply, and some democracy that is also applied there. So, whereas that's not true for NGOs. Recently, however, the role of NGOs and some of the private hospitals has become more significant because the ministry has kind of insisted on collaboration. So now every few months, I think it's every month, the 40 largest NGOs that are involved, what's called the health cluster, are united by the World Health Organization, and everybody discusses what's going on, what the projects are, and how to line up. And we try to make competition useful and friendly rather than repetitive or redundant, so that people are doing work that's complementary rather than oppositional. Because fundamentally, I think we all realize that NGOs can sometimes be out for their own survival and good name rather than for the benefit of the population. So by the ministry there, they kind of followed the Rwandan example for people who are familiar under this like famous doctor named Dr. Agnes. And she sort of brought the NGOs and said, like, now you guys are going to do what we want rather than what you want without any oversight. And the Gazans have been doing a lot of that. And I think it finally means that we, the internationals, have an important role to play. The biggest roles that we have, number one is training. We train in and out of country. And then number two is political pressure. You know, if the Ministry of Health says, I want X or Y or Z to come through the borders, it's going to be much harder than if the United Nations or World Health Organization says that this is needed and we want to bring it in. And I think, again, to gush about you, Jessica, like Gisha is a really good example of this. Like, do you really think if Palestinians talked about the blacklist of the blockade that it would have made it out there? Whereas, you know, when Gisha published the list of what they saw as like the blacklists and gray lists, everybody paid attention.
Just explain what that is, Tarek, because I don't. Tarek?
The blacklists are, so Israel has never, and please correct me on this, Jessica, but Israel has never published a list of what's allowed in and what's not allowed in. It's on a case-by-case basis. And so what Gisha did at one point is they actually took a list of all the things that had been banned and said, here's what they're banning. You know, things like chocolate or cloves or, you know, just ridiculous stuff like that. You know, of course, they ban stuff like rockets and guns. We all expect that. But to also ban medical supplies because you say that they're dual use, it's absolutely ridiculous. And what's not banned is delayed by months and months. It's just unacceptable.
If I can just add to that really briefly, just to say that that list has now been published, but as a result of Gisha's work and applying political pressure for its publication. But what Tarek said is really critical in terms of entry of supplies, that Israel maintains what's referred to as a dual use list for entry of goods into Gaza, which is extraordinarily extensive compared to all international standards. Yeah, and takes a very long time to coordinate entry.
Rob, you got time for one last question before we go? I see 22 questions already piled up from the audience.
Okay.
So.
Just quickly, we've talked mostly, Tarek, about physicians, just the role nurses play in the community and also in the hospital, and whether they have the same issues with respect to being paid. And then just as an underpinning of that, I mean, I don't know, given what you're saying, who would want to go into the health profession, but just the foundation there in terms of training that's available for healthcare professionals.
Okay, so the nurses obviously are the most critical part of care because you end up sort of being able to deploy them more widely. There are more of them, there's more academies and so on. There's just one little quirk of Palestinian education that I think is going to call out all of our, and definitely my internal or like internalized sexism, which is that the large majority of Palestinian doctors are women, and the large majority of Palestinian nurses are men. So yeah, which is really an interesting phenomenon to kind of interact with when you're there. And it's just a little quirk of the way that the education system happens there, in that people who rank highest on this one final exam get to select the seats. And the women for years and years, this is probably 30 years old as sort of like an observation, women have traditionally occupied almost 100 of the top 100 seats, to the point where like medical schools will hold seats for men just to kind of get some men into the profession. So it's interesting because we very often talk about how medicine can, like, I think we sort of talk about all of the different team dynamics that exist, and doctors are obviously a big part of it, but the allied health professionals are the actual foundation of the system there. Because the doctors are just not that many. They burn out very, very quickly, and indeed they tend to have to concentrate on the worst cases. So when you talk about trying to do preventative healthcare or trying to do public health, it's the nurses that drive it. Like the coronavirus response has been almost entirely driven by nursing teams, which is quite remarkable.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Rob. Now, Grafton Ross is working in the background looking at the questions. And Grafton, if you got the first one to pitch to, I've reminded people, please ask questions relating to the Gaza health system. Don't ask Dr. Loubani about what he thinks of the new Israeli government or what he thinks of BDS or what he thinks of, let's keep it focused on the areas where he has the most concrete knowledge and expertise. Grafton?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Ken?
Yes,
Good.
can.
There are a lot of questions, and I'll try to combine them in a way. There was, Peter mentioned in his introduction about the damage to the 3D printing plant. And one of our questioners is asking about damage to the Al Shifa hospital. And apparently you were running a fundraising campaign to purchase solar panels for that hospital. And the questioner is wondering, what is the current status of that?
Yeah, so the project to outfit hospitals with solar power is called Empower Gaza, the Canadian side of that. And basically there are really two major chapters for us of that. One of them ran in 2015 and fundraised in collaboration with Islamic Relief Canada about $1.5 million that then went to Canadian dollars, that is, that then went to implementing solar power on 4 of the hospitals in Gaza. One of which was bombed during this particular war. That project was successful beyond our expectations for 2 reasons. One, we were able to actually implement the solar power over time. That was great. The Israelis had banned their 3 major components: solar power, solar panels, inverters, and batteries. And during the project, all 3 of them were banned at one time or the other, but we were kind of able to coordinate eventually and get whatever was not banned at that exact moment. So the main success was we outfitted these hospitals with solar power so that they could run their intensive care areas, so that they could run their dialysis areas and one operating room and a little bit of emergency room lighting. That means, before that, to give you an idea, if somebody was on a ventilator, so when somebody is really, really sick, we take away their ability to breathe and we put them on machines that we call life support machines. And those machines will then do functions for people. Well, the way it used to work is that we would have a family member sitting beside the patient. And when the power would cut off, the family member would then have to assume the functions of the machine, quickly switching over from automatic to manual, and then in the case of ventilators, start inflating a balloon. I can tell you, fully professional doctors who've been working for years, who don't necessarily experience the stress of resuscitations every day, I'm very often telling them, how to deal with the bags. You're inflating it too much, you're inflating it too fast, so on, because people get really stressed out. So of course, we were having lots of problems because the families are generally lay people. And they would be there trying to help their family member out, but often wouldn't be able to do the right thing. We don't have to worry about that anymore, and that's a huge blessing. Dialysis was another one. Often patients wouldn't be able to get their dialysis for weeks at a time because that's cleaning of the kidneys, cleaning of the blood when the kidneys are failing. And that's because when their turn would come up, there wouldn't be electricity and maybe the generators were out of diesel. So this is one really huge win. The other one, though, that I really love is that we proved the feasibility of the project. And when we proved the feasibility of the project, it created this race. In fact, one of the biggest hospitals that we wanted to outfit with solar panel was going to take up about 60% of the budget of the project. And another NGO came in and was like, hey, can we do this one? Because we want to do this one. We want to do the biggest hospital in Gaza's solar project. But please go right ahead. It's a victory for everybody. So I think these projects are about 2 things: doing the thing and also proving that it's feasible, which really is what CLIA is about too. The second phase of the Empower Gaza project is to try to put solar panels on clinics all over Gaza. The clinics generally are run only by daytime, and so you would actually give them 100% of their needs by having solar panels even without any batteries. So we're trying very, very hard to do that. The Canadian government has committed twice to doing that, once right after I was shot, and I asked for $15 million, and then once sort of a month ago. And so far, we're not seeing delivery. I don't really know how to make that happen, how to make that delivery happen. But I don't think that the government of Canada is going to be a main funder for that. So we're trying to find alternate funding for that project.
Thank you. I think a number of people are mystified by the difficulty of getting medications into Gaza. I mean, there's really no military use for any of these medications, I'm assuming. Can you explain a bit, what is the process for getting medications in? Do they have to be purchased in Israel, or do they have to go through, are they purchased elsewhere and they have to go through some kind of customs procedure, or how does it work? And why are the problems?
Okay. So let's take a contemporary example to kind of explain the situation. So many of the audience here, because they're interested in Israel-Palestine, have heard that Israel donated a bunch of Pfizer shots to the Palestinians. That's the story. So what really happened there? The Palestinians purchased from Pfizer 4 million shots. And Pfizer told them we can't deliver for a number of reasons. And so Pfizer then suggested a workaround. We will ask the Israelis to give 1.4 million of their shots that are close to expiry, and then we will replenish the Israeli stock with fresh supply. Okay, so that's actually what happened. The Israelis were like, maybe yes, maybe no. They insisted on changes in the contract. For example, the contract with Pfizer was Pfizer with the state of Palestine. Israelis do not recognize the state of Palestine, and so they insisted that that be changed to the Palestinian Authority. That slowed things down until both parties were satisfied with some outcome. I don't know exactly what outcome they decided upon. And then, of course, the war in Gaza happened. Well, for sure, you're not going to give any medication to the Palestinians at that point. You're trying to kill them. I mean, like, it starts to make sense if you think of Palestinians. For example, like, why am I denied entry? I've been trying to get into Gaza for 2.5 months now. Why am I denied entry? Why have I been to Israeli jail 4 times while trying to enter Gaza? Why am I constantly under threat? If you look at it and you ask yourself, like, what is it about a doctor? It stops to make sense. But I think the best way to look at it is that the Israelis are scared of the Palestinians. I mean, the Palestinians, to them, are trying to kill every single Israeli. And when you talk to Israelis on the street, there are lots of Israelis on the street who are fully convinced that every Palestinian is trying to kill every Israeli. And so you can think from the perspective of the Israeli systems, of the Palestinians not as innocent occupied people who deserve healthcare, but rather as little Hitlers. And if all of these people are little Hitlers, then it starts to make sense to be obstructionist in the delivery of this medical care. And it starts to make sense to block me from going in to deliver care. And I think that's probably the best way to look at why there are so many obstructions, to the point where Israel is self-harming by not allowing the Palestinians access to the COVID vaccine. They will never get the COVID pandemic under control in Israel until every single Palestinian is vaccinated. They will never. But I think that fear, that concern, very, very valid rooting to it. It's not like it comes out of nowhere. It's rooted in the history of the Israeli state. It's rooted in some of the things that have happened with the Palestinians and some of the things that Palestinian factions have said. But the end result is that innocent people who, by international law, deserve care aren't receiving it. So I think if you look at it and you say, well, these are medications, why aren't they coming in? It'll be hard to understand. But if you look at it as, this is combat and these are people who are trying to kill us, so we're not going to help them, then it starts to make a little bit more sense.
Thank you. There's a number of medical professionals in the audience, and a number of them have asked how they could get involved. What are the mechanisms? What organizations? How do they go about it? You mentioned you have difficulty yourself getting into Gaza.
Yeah, so really the medical work on Gaza kind of happens on three major fronts. The first one is the domestic front. So for example, lots of my colleagues, obviously I go to Gaza here, I work in a department. And so that department covers my shifts when I need to go. For example, when the war started, I basically called up my chief and I said, hey, listen, if I can go, the moment I get approved to go, I'm gonna go. And she was like, sure, you just figure it out and we'll deal with your shifts when that problem arises. For better or worse, obviously I didn't make it, but having said that, that backline support is absolutely essential and everybody here can help that way. That means through providing relief and coverage for people who can go, providing money for people who can go, and also providing political cover and help for people who can go. If people like me go enough, people like me will get shot, will get killed, will get jailed. And when that happens, the people on the home front really need to activate in a powerful way. Otherwise, it's not going to work. You have to be able to take care of people who go out onto the front lines. Otherwise, they'll be less willing and less capable. So the home front is important. The other one is actually going there. Well, what are the organizations? There's an abundance of organizations. If the viewers who are asking this question are primarily Arab speaking, then I'd recommend an Arabic organization like Physicians for Human Rights Israel, which is Arabic language as well. I mean, also Hebrew language for people who are in that category, or any of the Red Crescents. The Qatar Red Crescent is heavily involved. So are almost all of the Red Crescents that have any kind of understanding with Israel. I think Jordanian is the other really big one that provides lots of services. So on the Arabic side, there's that. On the English side, and obviously the French side, there are organizations like Médecins du Monde and Médecins Sans Frontières, which are two excellent organizations. And I think probably the most important one there would be ICRC, which is the International Committee for the Red Cross, where they also will help facilitate entry. And then the UN system, like the World Health Organization. The biggest question to ask yourself is, are you the kind of person who wants to do one-off missions, 6 months, one time, you're done? Or the kind of person who wants to keep going back regularly? Because if you want to keep going back regularly, then it's not going to work with an NGO. They usually have minimum commitments of 3 months, 6 months, something like that. And then other excellent organizations, Medical Aid for Palestinians in the UK is absolutely fantastic and has been doing really, really great work. To some extent, also Medical Aid for Palestine in Canada does some good work too. And if people are really interested in a more systems approach, then working with Islamic Relief Canada, they can pitch them an idea. For example, somebody pitched an eye project relatively recently, and then there was lots of chatter about that, and then work on how to implement it. So I think that's another path. The third thing is international. So right now we're seeing a lot of struggle happening on the international academic front. So of course there's a political front, but for us doctors, we're much better at the academic front. So writing letters into academic journals, asking why articles are taken down from places like Scientific American or Lancet, and making sure that there's good, rigorous science about the impacts of occupation, the impacts of blockade, and the medical responses that are happening to them.
Thank you. Grafton, you got a couple more there?
Yes, you spoke a little bit about the Pfizer vaccines, but perhaps you could give us a more complete update on what the situation of COVID is in Gaza at this time.
I don't have the exact numbers from today or yesterday, but when I was really tracking this very closely not too long ago, we had basically crossed, just before the war, we had crossed the point where more people had died from COVID than had died from the last, sort of couple of years worth of wars combined. So we have a relatively high death rate right now that we know about. And once we do the work on excess deaths, which is a much better predictor of how many deaths COVID actually caused, I think it's going to run away and be far and away worse death toll than all of the wars combined in the last sort of 15 years, probably including this last war. So the situation is dire, it is very bad, and there is no end in sight. There will be no end. When we talked about the Pfizer thing, one of the stipulations that the Israelis put on the Pfizer deal was that the Palestinians weren't allowed to transfer any doses to Gaza. So there will be no end until all Gazans are vaccinated. And what we'll see is a little bit of an experiment in how deviant the variants can get from the original, where basically there's a strain of COVID, it's going to run through, there's going to become herd immunity, which is then going to put a selective pressure on a variant, which is going to run through, and it's going to keep doing that until everybody gets vaccinated. And that's what we saw in this one region of Brazil called Manaus, which we considered in the medical community to be our first experiment on herd immunity. About 75% of the population was infected by Christmas. And then, shocking all of us, it took less than 2 months for a new strain, the Brazil strain, to, I guess probably the Manaus strain we could call it, to start running around again and doing the rounds and killing people who it had spared the time before. So I think it's dire. We don't really have a good way out. We ran a project called PPE for Gaza, in which we manufactured PPE domestically. That part of the project has been done for months, but we also had to import some things that we just couldn't manufacture domestically, like N95 respirators, and those have yet to arrive. And it is not a certainty that Israel will allow those to enter, because they might consider respirators to be dual-use items. So it's really hard to imagine an outcome for Gaza that doesn't include full vaccination.
Tarek, I'd like to ask a bit of a question about your own personal. You mentioned that you've been in Israeli jails a couple of times. Just what's the process? You have to get permission from the Israelis. Do you normally get that before you go, or do you turn up there and say, I want to go? And why are you in Israeli jail? Like, how does that happen?
Yeah, so basically, I never go without having permission to go. It has to be signed off by these community liaisons and like other such Orwellian named offices that are called like civilian this or that occupation authority. So I never even leave Canada until I have full permission. So why do I end up in jail? Well, I'll tell you about one of my friends at Ben Gurion, a woman named Ronit. So Ronit has interrogated me countless times. I mean, I've been to Gaza well over 50 times. I haven't done a count recently, but well over 50 times. I've gotten to know most of the people out there. Well, this particular day, Ronit couldn't find my entry papers. I'm like, Ronit, you know me. You know I wouldn't come without these papers. Like, what are you doing? And so she's like, well, I can't find them, so it just doesn't matter. And I'm not going to try until tomorrow. So I'm like, all right, fine. In that case, let me make my phone call to my lawyer so that she can know that I'm going to go to jail tonight. So they didn't allow me that until finally it kind of came down to like, I wasn't going to leave the airport until I made my phone call. I made the phone call. Actually, I ended up making it to one of the, like, I don't know, colonels or something like this in the army, whose number I had. And then he talked to them, figured out what the problem was, and was like, listen, Tarek, you're going to go to jail tonight. It's fine. I promise you tomorrow will be done. So that time was only one night. I go to jail. I knew the people at jail too. They're nice people. Everybody's nice people. They gave me a schnitzel sandwich. It was nice. It's like a good cold cut. So everybody is nice along the way. Like the cogs are never the problem, right? It's the system that's the monster. There are some truly, genuinely terrible people, but generally not. And, the next day I came back and Bernie was like, so you were telling the truth. You do have your permission. Here you go. And and the way that she apologized was that the next time I came in, I waited 8 hours. So they sat me in the interrogation area for 8 hours, but they didn't actually interrogate me. They didn't actually strip search me, which sort of shows you that it's security theater. I've sat naked in those rooms for hours and hours and hours. Like, it's ridiculous. So, and I've obviously been strip searched like countless times. You have to get comfortable with your body and shrinkage and being in cold rooms. It's just, you deal with it. I think the reality is that I try not to talk about these stories because a lot of people will look at them and then use them to dissuade themselves from going. And I can understand the why. It's degrading and humiliating even when you try to make the best of it. But having said that, these are obstacles that the Israelis try to raise to reduce and prevent this work. And so I think it's incumbent on us when we're doing this work to just take it as one of the costs. If I'm traveling somewhere and I need to quarantine, well, I just take it as a cost of travel. And I think this is kind of somewhat similar. If I go there enough times, I'll go to jail. I was in jail once for 3 weeks. That was a long, long time ago, way before I was a doctor. I was in jail, subsequently. I think the longest really when I was a doctor was about a week. It's not that big of a deal. Jail sucks, but if you're a person who carries a foreign passport, you take away one of the keys to being in jail, which is that you're going to get out. And so it's just a matter of time. And nowadays, most of the interrogators don't beat me anymore. So that the use of violence is like very selective and very careful. Israelis don't usually beat somebody like me unless they feel that there's a very good reason or something that they're going to get out of it. And so they're very selective about like when they want to hit me or when they physically threaten me. And a big part of that is that I don't care anymore. Like, what are you going to do to me that the Egyptians didn't do to me or that the Israelis didn't do to me before? Like, it's one of the joys of being older is perspective. So.
Okay. Grafton.
I'm happy to jump in with a question. If,
sure. Go ahead, Jessica.
Unless Grafton has, I want to give opportunity.
Please go.
Okay. Well, actually, I did want to pick up on a question I saw in the Q&A anyway, and I think it's a particularly interesting issue in Gaza. And someone asked if you could tell us a bit about psychiatric or psychological services in Gaza. And I think it's particularly interesting, but as Peter pointed out in his introductory presentation, that the population in Gaza is extraordinarily young, and I think I think that's kind of an interesting connection. What sort of hope and kind of mental health, what's the state of the mental health of the young people in Gaza, and what services do they have access to?
Yeah, it's I mean, that's a really interesting problem to try to deal with. I told you the story about that one doctor who cracked when we were in the emergency room during one of the wars. And our response to that was, I think, the correct, I'm going to put that in air quotes, the correct response for the moment. We're in the middle of something, it's not the time. What happens when you're in the middle of something for 10 years, 15 years, 45 years, 75 years? And so there is this tension of, suck it up and deal with it. And we have to do something about the mental health problems that exist. One of the doctors who ran the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, he's passed away now, Iyad Sarraj, he came up with this concept of like a continuing chronic traumatic stress disorder. So the P in PTSD is post. You had the trauma, and now the trauma is done and you're trying to rebuild. That question of, well, what happens when the trauma never ends, when there is no post, is the question that he tried to answer. And I don't think, even though he developed lots of really great tactics and strategies, that we have a really good response to that. So the GCMHP is excellent. The Gaza Community Mental Health Program is really excellent, but of course it's under-resourced. Everything is under-resourced. And so the main supplier of mental health help is families and other people who are themselves traumatized. Somebody's bleeding in front of you to death, and you're trying to help them while you're bleeding yourself to death. It's a concept that we can understand about physical trauma, but it's exactly what's happening with mental trauma. People are resilient and they are incredibly happy. They smile all the time. They live every day. They marry. I live over a wedding hall when I'm in Gaza, and there are weddings every Thursday and Friday, which are like the weekend there, because people are living their lives. They're just doing the best that they can. But in terms of the quality is pretty poor just because the resources are out. And also, let's say if, God forbid, somebody here were to be involved in a war, the odds are the therapist wouldn't be. And so also the therapists themselves are deeply traumatized when they're trying to deal with people who are deeply traumatized. It's really difficult.
Thank you.
Grafton?
Sorry, it took me a moment to get unmuted. What are the possibility of bringing patients from Gaza to Canada? I recall that Dr. Abouleish had a project a number of years ago where he was proposing to bring, I think, 100 children to Canada for medical treatment. And what is the process?
Yes, I believe it's a combined project between Dr. Izzeddin Abouleish, who himself lost, I think it was 3 daughters and lots of family in the 2008-2009 war, and Dr. Neil Arya, who is also very important in the global health space in Canada, and a few other doctors. I support every project that facilitates or tries to facilitate healthcare for Palestinian civilians. And actually, I should probably not use the term civilians there, like just for Palestinians who are affected. And I think that these projects are really, really important. For me personally, I try to put my emphasis on capacity building. A project like this would be great and I think would serve a very important purpose. One of the considerations that somebody like me would have about that project is what happens when the project is over. When the project is over, the patients will go back and then they'll come back into a system that neither treated them nor has increased its capacity to treat them. So I think that these projects are important as part of an overall look at how to increase the capacity. They are, of course, very expensive. And so I think we have to treat them as well as opportunities to understand the situation a little bit more. Like, for example, if the patients come and then talk to us about what their experiences are and kind of use that as a way to increase awareness. But of course, that then becomes not a patient-related health project, that becomes a political awareness project, which probably is a non-starter for the organizers of that. So I think we have to be very supportive of every project that helps, and at the same time, try to focus on it as part of a larger effort to build capacity and increase the ability to treat patients there, rather than kind of have a lottery. Because functionally, if you bring 10 patients or 100 patients to Canada, well, there were 22,000 people shot during the Great March of Return. I mean, there were tens of thousands of people wounded mentally or physically during this particular round. So I think we can really say that anybody who comes here, even if it's 100 people, would be the lottery winners. And I think that can sometimes, that warrants a lot of very careful considerations, that it's done in a way that is healthy for everybody.
Afton, I'm going to now see that we're at 8:55, so I'm going to have, unfortunately, end the Q&A period. We will keep track of the questions, and if they're ones that we can send by email to Dr. Loubani, if he has time, he might be able to help us with some of them. I see some people wanted information on specific websites and so on. I think we can help put together that in a follow-up email. Could you end the put back the screen share for a second, please, Iman? While
Can I make a request
sorry.
as well?
Yeah, sure, by all means.
So I don't know how much time everybody has, but I'm really curious to also hear from you guys. I've done a lot of talking, which of course, as anybody who's ever met a doctor will know, is like what we love to do. We're always full of ourselves, but it would be really nice to just kind of like listen to everybody else, even who's in the panel, and just chat. So maybe after we close, unless we have to end the room, I'm happy to stay around and just kind of chill and chat, if that's okay.
Well, I'll invite the panelists and those who want to hang on. I want to go to the final slide there, please, Iman. The one after this one. So I just wanted to remind people that this is one of a series of webinars that we've been doing every month since COVID stopped us doing public. Our last public event was when Tarek came to Ottawa in January of 2020. OFIP is a voluntary and self-financed organization. We do this out of our own pocket and out of donations that are given to us. And we have also we're happy to tell Dr. Loubani that we will make a substantial contribution to him or to an organization that he wants to direct us to in appreciation of his time here tonight. So we will put this in a follow-up email. Let me just come back to end the screen share then, please. I also want to remind people that our next two webinars, we don't plan to do one in July, but or August. We'll start again in September, and we have two lined up. One is with Dr. Munir Nasiba, talking about what's happening in Jerusalem, how Palestinians in Jerusalem are resisting the ethnic cleansing, the attempt to convert the ancient multi-religious and multicultural. I can turn that. Just I don't want the screen sharing. I just wanted to thank you. Into to Judaize Jerusalem. And the other webinar we have lined up is on the issue of Palestinian children and Israeli jails and incarceration. So we will be sending you emails on those when those webinars are set up. I just want to take the time here to thank Tarek Loubani, your calmness and your control and your ability to not have smoke coming out your ears all the time you're talking is very impressive. I think that the OFIP motto is to be firm on the principles and very soft on the language. And I think you personify that. You're a model for me and a model for people who want to have a serious discussion about the Israel-Palestine issue. So thank you so much for taking some time with us tonight. Rob Cushman, thank you very much for taking time off. I know that you're under a lot of pressure in your current responsibilities. I know you're getting emails all the time for health issues, and we appreciate from knowing you personally, I know that this is a 24-hour-a-day job you're working on. And so thank you so much for agreeing to be part of our panel. And of course, to Jessica, I'm so happy that Tarek made you blush. Gisha is a terrific organization, and so are you. So thank you so much. So that's my pitch to all of you. But Tarek, you said that those who want to hang on, I don't know how I'm going to manage this because we have 100 people on the line. I can't have a conversation of 100, but those who want to hang on longer will try to deal with it for another 15 minutes or so. Tarek, do you have a suggestion about how to handle this? No.
Not really, no. I guess, I mean, it's not really an option to just have everybody free chat or to like have everybody voice chat. So maybe we can monitor the chat, and then also like even just us sort of chatting a little bit more and hearing a little bit more from Dr. Cushman and from Jessica.
Here's a thought.
We had nothing from Lynn, so.
Lynn is both a nurse and a doctor, and she's had these terrific experiences in northern Quebec and in Africa, and so she's familiar with working under difficult circumstances, providing medicine. So that's great. Listen, I do have a practical suggestion. Maybe we could use the chat for this. People could plunk in questions or comments in the chat. Tarek, you can keep an eye of what's in the chat, and you can see what things you want to pick up on. How would that work? That way, everybody could be writing at the same time.
Yeah, that works for me. And I also want to just say a shout out to Larry Haven, who was my activist daddy when I was in Halifax. So when I first got into the issue, I knew nothing about Palestine. I knew nothing about anything, and sort of got introduced to Larry, sat with him and his wife, Judith, I believe her name was, and just sort of chatted and learned so much about Israel and Palestine, and about, also lots of perspectives about Judaism as well. So anyway, I don't know if you're still here, Larry, but thank you. One of the ones who made me the man I am today.
I do see a couple of questions about what items have been blacklisted. Geisha has a list of it. I included a link in the chat, and I will also include that link in the follow-up email. A follow-up email will be sent to all of you asking for your feedback. The feedback I'm happy to share with Dr. Tarek. And it will also provide a link to the recording of this event for friends of yours who are not able to attend it.
And maybe I can do some questions of my own now that
Absolutely.
we're at this stage. So I guess Lynn and Robert, since you guys have done lots of work in sort of other parts of the world as well, and I feel I'm quite new to that, what do you think are some of the things that we can really learn from some of the other places that you've worked that you're not seeing applied in places like Palestine?
Well, anyway, Tarek, thank you. It's terrific. I think Peter said it well in terms of summarizing what you've done and how you do it. I guess to us, I mean, just Lynn and I were sort of nodding our heads. I mean, Gaza is quite different. It's, you probably know from your Latin American experiences, I presume, and we do from our African experiences and our Northern experiences, is that I mean, when you're in a war zone, that's a very different thing. I mean, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking of, we were.
Oops.
It was too powerful.
Packed up with people, just, and you had to sort them out. But I remember that we all pulled together. For example, we ran out of IV bottles, so we sterilized them. We re-sharpened needles and sterilized them. And the radiology technician, we had so many kids, we had so many people with kids with fractures that we had to, the radiologist technician he was a welder, a Danish welder. So he welded all these beds together, and somebody made braces. Like, people make things from, like, you can't imagine. You think you have no resources. I mean, I work with people. I'm a rehab specialist, and we have all these fancy gizmos to put prosthetics and braces and things. And there we had people who just made things from scraps, and we managed, kids. I looked after kids with polio who had braces that didn't come from any, any special place. And we just made do, and it's amazing.
I think the one thing that's very interesting, Tarek, I'll just finish quickly. The hospital we were at was a classic British mission hospital. It was very colonial. And 30 years later, there was one European on staff. Yeah. Whereas when we were there in the late 70s, it was a teaching hospital too, but most of the major positions were filled by expats. So to me, that's the real success story. Actually, if you want to go, it's St. Francis Hospital. Just Google St. Francis Hospital, Zambia, and you'll see quite a bit that's interesting.
But you
Anyway.
mentioned training, you
Yeah,
see, as
training.
to what your contribution can be. And whether Rob and I worked with the Cree and the Inuit on the north, and that was one of the things we did there too, is to get some training going. And that's your real legacy, I think.
And you mentioned that. So thank you
Yeah.
for that.
That's amazing and so good to. One of my favorite things about working in Latin America is it feels like I'm looking into the future of the Middle East, and you can kind of see some of the mistakes that were made that I want to try to avoid. Like for example, one of the things that I saw in Latin America was trying to carbon copy the Western system, and in Gaza right now, if you were to go into the emergency and wait more than 10 minutes, it would be unthinkable. Whereas I think yesterday, not a single person I saw when I was in the emergency here in London had waited less than 6 hours. So I don't want to carbon copy 6-hour waits. I want to take the best from the Western system and apply it. So I think that's the trick also with the training.
Yeah, and we didn't see any vaccine hesitancy. Let me tell you, the major, the number one killer was measles.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, my mother's sister died of measles. So, you know, when it came time for vaccines in the West Bank, my grandma lined them all up and they waited for 5 days to get vaccinated.
Yeah.
You're right. It was unthinkable to not get vaccinated.
It's hard when you see people who complain about which brand they want. And I'm thinking, okay, all the people I saw with tetanus, diphtheria, typhoid,
rabies.
Polio, rabies, people would have died to have a vaccine.
Anyway, thank you. There are a lot of people who want your attention, so thank you. And Peter will probably connect us by email. So that was a wonderful session you gave tonight.
Very interesting.
I think we'll turn it over to some others.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you very much, Lynn. Okay.
Can I just break in? Jenny in the audience mentions that in 2009 she was a member of a Catholic worker peace team that was able to bring supplies in through the Rafah crossing from Egypt. And she's wondering if those kinds of personal initiatives or small group initiatives are still possible in this day.
I'll comment on that a little bit, but I actually think probably Jessica's the expert on this topic. In terms of the Rafah crossing, the heyday of getting things in was basically from sort of 2007, 2008 through the war, and then until 2013. And there were so many convoys and so much went in. It really was like a golden age where we got so much in. Since then, I think the Egyptians have taken a very, very different tack. And until this war, we saw no indication that they were willing to help out in getting medical supplies or any supplies into Gaza. I don't know why they're so helpful right now. I don't know the politics well enough to say, but the facts on the ground are that there seem to be lots of heavy machinery coming in, lots of concrete coming in, lots of rebuilding equipment coming in, which is interesting. Jessica, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. I mean, I'm a little out of touch with the latest happenings and what's coming in and coming out. I left the region about 1.5 years ago, so I'm a little out of touch. But certainly, you're absolutely right that since 2009, things have gotten a lot worse. Our area of focus at Gisha is entry through the Israeli crossings. So I won't comment on Rafah so much the way Tarek did, but in terms of goods coming through Kerem Shalom, which is the Israeli crossing, Israeli controlled crossing between Gaza and Israel, there are still groups that go in. I mean, certainly when I was working at Gisha, there were teams of medical staff that would go in, and Tarek being an example, of doctors that go in, and some do go in groups, more established groups that are affiliated with NGOs, as Tarek mentioned. I would guess in terms of supplies, the more likely route would be to actually donate to a larger a larger organization that is able to bring them in, rather than taking them in, taking the supplies in yourself. But if you're going in to provide services, there are certainly groups that do that. At Gisha, we actually had a case on behalf of a group of doctors out of Washington, DC, that had been going for every year for a decade, I believe, until a couple of years ago, they were denied entry permits for the first time ever. And we fought a long legal battle about it at Gisha. We were eventually successful at getting them in. But I think the point is that the Israeli authorities are really fighting against it, and Gisha is waging more and more legal battles of this nature. But if you are part of a group that's trying to go in, Gisha is an available service. I'm no longer working there, so I'm not doing this as a form of advertising or fundraising, which I used to do. But they are a terrific organization that is available to assist groups precisely for this reason. And medical services and care are one of the very few exceptions of people that are allowed in and out of the strip.
I think
Hope that helps a little. Yeah.
I'm going to pull the plug there, if that's okay with everybody. Rob, I know you've got some work to do. I know that. I could just tell by the way you're looking at your cell phone. Tarek, you've been very generous with your time tonight. That's great. Maybe we have a chance, we'll get you back again sometime in the future. Thank you so much to Val, your assistant, who helped me coordinate this. I had some heartburn because I wasn't talking with you directly, but she was very good at holding my hand, so that was great. Thanks to Ayman Ayub in the background, who's been doing the technical work, so making sure this all works. And thanks to Grafton Ross for checking out the question and answers. Thanks to everybody who attended. My apologies to those questions weren't covered, but we do have limits. So thanks everybody. Good night, and I guess a happy and perhaps reflective Canada Day. I'm wearing my Aboriginal t-shirt here this evening. Reflective Canada Day is in order. So thank you very much. Good evening to everybody.
Thank you.